Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American Republic?
Hello everybody, it's Wednesday, October the 8th, 2025, in 5 days. Appropriately, perhaps, on October the 13th, on Monday, it will be Columbus Day, which is a controversial holiday in the United States. For some, Christopher Columbus was a saint founding America. For others, he was a great villain, perhaps even a mass murderer. And indeed, in today, in America, there's a debate about whether this day should be called Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. And it often, I think, reveals people's politics, whether they would like to call it Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day. I don't suppose you can call it both. My guest today is more of an expert on Columbus than on indigenous people. He's a very distinguished historian, particularly of the discovery of the so-called New World. Matthew Restall teaches at Penn State and has an intriguing new book out, appropriately enough for Columbus/Indigenous Day. It's called The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. It's just out, and Matthew is joining us from State College in Pennsylvania, where he lives and teaches. Matthew, let's get to the heart of things. Congratulations on the new book. Should it be called Columbus Day or Indigenous Peoples Day? Which side of the debate are you on?
Well, hello, Andrew. Thank you for having me on the show. And like, you're just going to get stuck right in there with the thorny, tricky question, right? And my answer might seem a little kind of squirrely, but it is consistent with what I've tried to do with this book. And my answer is, I think every community should have the right to decide how they want to celebrate that day. I don't think there should be any outside imposition on any town or business or school or whatever it is. Everybody should be able to decide which way they want to go, whether they want it to be Columbus Day, Indigenous Peoples Day, or some kind of a combination. And I think that a lot of communities have been trying to find solutions like that. I know in some places the day is Indigenous Peoples Day, but the month of October is Italian Heritage or Italian American Heritage Month. So if that's a compromise that works for people, that's the kind of thing that I would support.
Bit mealy-mouthed, Matthew, but I guess you have to be. Otherwise you get thrown out of your university. What would Columbus say, do you think? Do you think, I mean, you're a biographer of him. You're not certainly the first or the last. But would he be thrilled by having a day named after him? Did he believe that he was a historic figure?
Oh, absolutely. He would be absolutely thrilled. Yes. I mean, when I set out to write about this, I tried to approach the figure of Columbus himself as an individual with an open mind, without a kind of preconceived idea that he was likable or unlikable, or or the extremes that some people think he's a holy hero and should be a saint, and others think he's the absolute opposite, as like the Antichrist. So I discovered that he was not a particularly likable person. I don't think he was a monster, but he wasn't particularly likable, and partly that was to do with, and here I'm answering your question, his gradual descent into a kind of manic narcissism, where he was convinced that he was God's agent, that he even could be found in the Old Testament of the Bible. That's how important he was in his mind, in kind of God's larger cosmic vision of the destiny of humanity, that he played this incredibly important role. I don't know if he believed it at the beginning. I think it's a little bit of a case of him kind of swallowing his own medicine, right? And that over the
Who
course
does
of
that
his
remind you
voyages,
of? We don't want to get political, Matthew, but I think one or two people could think of some contemporary examples of this. By definition, I mean, you've written a number of books on the discovery by European adventurers of North America, South America, the New World. You wrote your When Montezuma Met Cortez, who was another figure. You wrote a book called Seven Myths of the Spanish Conquest. You've written a book about the conquistadors. Shouldn't we take it for granted that these characters, who were remarkable adventurers, weren't particularly nice people? Why would we expect them to be nice? I mean, Drake, you're originally English. Drake wasn't very nice either. I mean, by definition, these adventurers were hard, unforgiving men. If they weren't, they wouldn't have done what they did. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that is fair. That is exactly what we would expect. And I would sort of want to lead that conversation a little bit more into what is the historical context that produces these men or allows men like this to rise up through the ranks and become prominent. And I would say that's a conversation about warfare and empire, right? In a situation of war, certain people kind of rise up that maybe aren't particularly nice. Maybe they're actually, sociopaths, but a situation of warfare and imperial invasion allows those qualities which in a peaceful, civilized society might not be desirable and might cause chaos within that society. It allows those qualities to actually be a plus, as a positive. And I think that's definitely the case with the Spanish conquistadors. I think Columbus is a little bit of a different character. So when you say, well, I should have expected that he wasn't going to be particularly likable. I think he didn't start out with any kind of understanding or vision of exactly where he was going to end up, contrary to what some of the biographies say. He was just a uneducated Genoese sailor trying to achieve social ambition. I think as his life unfolded, he sort of picked up more of these ambitious ideas and was influenced by what he saw in Spain and was influenced by the culture of the conquistadors. But I think it came to him kind of later in life. But also, the thing about Columbus is that part of why I wrote this book was because he has inspired such extreme opinions. And I don't think the opinions are as extreme when it comes to conquistadors. I mean, yes, there are, but I don't think you could say, well, Cortez, Pizarro, Coronado, whatever, there are many, many people who have really a strong opinion that those are really important, heroic figures, and others who think completely the opposite. Whereas Columbus is unique in that sense, and that is something that I wanted to be able to explore and explain.
Yeah, one is because the conquistadors killed so many people directly or indirectly, whereas Columbus is more complicated. Very briefly, Matthew, and of course, your book, 9 Lives, covers the history of Columbus's life. When did he, so to speak, become Christopher Columbus? When was he embraced as this massive figure? Was it right from the beginning of the European colonization of North America, or did it take time?
I think you're going to think this is another. Well, actually, maybe you're not going to think this is another mealy-mouthed answer, but there's kind of two answers to it. The first of all is when he comes back from the first voyage, eventually, so now we're at 1493, eventually he gets the audience he's looking for with the Spanish monarchs. It happens to be in Barcelona. That's where they are when he catches up with them. At that moment, and in the months surrounding that moment, he becomes a European celebrity. Right, the word spreads around very quickly, and in the traditional biographies, the word spreads around very quickly because this is some extraordinary guy who's done something that no one ever imagined was possible, and so on. In fact, that's not the case at all. It's that everybody knows that sooner or later someone is going to find more islands, further across the ocean. This process has been going on for hundreds of years, and particularly intensely for the previous 40 or 50 years of Columbus's lifetime. So everybody is sort of anticipating that sooner or later, who's it going to be? If you're a betting man, you put money on the Portuguese because they've got most of the voyages. They have the strongest track record out there. But there's kind of a historical twist that results in Spain controlling the Canary Islands, which is the best launch point because of the way the winds go and so on. So this is all these details, and this stuff is all known to people in Europe at the time. So he becomes very famous in the sense that everyone's waiting to know who's going to be the guy to slot into that story, and he's the one. However, his fame becomes kind of an infamy very quickly as we move through the rest of his lifetime, the rest of the 40s into the next decade, and he's dead in 1506. It's only 13 years from when he returns from that first voyage, and his reputation declines because as a colonist, as a conquistador, as an imperial agent, he fails. Right? He just simply doesn't have those kinds of skills, and the Spaniards are never going to fully accept him.
Because he was from Genoa.
It's partly because he was from Genoa, so he's a foreigner, but more that he's just a sailor. So, see, the Genoese aristocracy are really well embedded. Well, Genoese merchant class and aristocracy are very well embedded in Seville, which is effectively it's the capital of Spain. I mean, it isn't literally, but in economic terms, it is. It's the launch board out into the Atlantic. So having Genoese ancestry and connections and so on is not a problem as long as they are the right kind. And he doesn't have those. He's just sort of a common sailor. You know, his father was a weaver and his grandfather was a cheesemaker and so on. So he's kind of denigrated in that sense, as that kind of low-ranking foreigner, but he's not able to acquire the political and diplomatic skills that would be required in order to successfully colonize those islands. He also does not understand, as the Spaniards do not understand, the nature of those indigenous communities. They are not like the ones in southern Spain that the Castilians and Aragonese have been conquering. Right, in 1492, the last Muslim kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula is conquered, and those conquered peoples are not like the peoples in the Caribbean. Right, they're not used to living in complex cities with stone buildings and complex social structures in which they provide labor for this and that. And I mean, these are extremely complex societies. The Caribbean societies are relatively simple, and people's kind of expectations of what they can be required to do are relatively simple, and so it's kind of a disaster. So that's the very long first answer. The second one is, after his death, there's then a very gradual increase in his reputation during the 16th century. Not so much in Spain, more kind of in Italy. That he's sort of among the Italian city-states. He's kind of hailed as something of an Italian hero. In Spain, it really depends on what your ideological position is. If you think that the colonies should be places where friars and the church rules, and that the overwhelming purpose is to convert indigenous peoples, then you're in kind of one camp, the camp of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a big Columbus supporter. He essentially kind of created in the 16th century the foundations for one of the modern visions of Columbus, which is Columbus as kind of a holy hero, and that Columbus's whole motivation was religious, and so on and so forth. But in the other camp, if you're more in the kind of the imperial Spain camp, that the colonies are about the glory of imperial Spain and wealth and Spanish civilization, but not just talking about religion in a larger sense, then Columbus is going to be somebody that you are going to kind of shunt aside and say, no, he didn't really do it.
Might we think of Columbus as a kind of Rorschach test? I mean, speaking to you from the West Coast, from Silicon Valley, Matthew, there's always been one interpretation that presents him as an entrepreneur, as a as a disruptor. And of course, he was, in a sense. I mean, he was doing this voyage to make money. As you say, he was from from lowly origins. He wasn't an aristocrat. Can we think of him in entrepreneurial terms? Is he the 16th century equivalent of Peter Thiel or Tim Berners-Lee or Steve Jobs?
Yeah, I mean, yes. And just thinking about him in kind of isolation as an individual, he was motivated by social mobility, by social ambition. I would say, despite all the crazy sort of pious narcissism that I talked about earlier, that the position that he comes to towards the end of his life, I think his overarching ambition, and one of the he succeeds in a way, the only thing he really succeeds in, based on his ambitions, is to found a noble dynasty. Right? He wants to found a Spanish aristocratic dynasty, and he wants his incomes and titles and everything to get passed on to his eldest son. He succeeds. That dynasty was established. It survives. In fact, it survives to this day. The 20th Admiral of the Ocean Sea, that's the kind of capstone title that Columbus acquired, was granted to him in 1493 as a result of that first voyage. That title is held by the 20th Admiral of the Ocean Sea, who is a Spanish naval officer and a businessman in Spain today, and his name is the same as his ancestor's name, Don Cristobal Colon. So he succeeded in that regard. So does that make him kind of an entrepreneur? Do you see him kind of as a modern figure? To some extent. But what I would say to that is the conquistadors, the Spanish conquistadors were entrepreneurs. Yeah, and I mean, in this book here and in previous books, I've talked about conquistadors as being armed entrepreneurs. That's the way to think of them. They put together an investment company, which in physical manifestation is ships and soldiers and sailors and so on, settlers. They put that together, and then they hope to then get a return on that investment in terms of immediately in terms of plunder, the seizing of indigenous or African peoples. We're talking about mostly in the New World, indigenous peoples to be sold as slaves. That money is then to pay off the investors and to generate profit. And then in the long run to win positions of authority from the crown, so that in the Americas, they can continue to act as entrepreneurs to make more money for themselves, right? Of course, they're paying a 20% flat tax to the crown in theory. So yeah, I think there's a lot to that argument, but I would want to kind of expand it out. And you're going to find when we talk about Columbus, I'm constantly saying, look, it's not just about Columbus. We've got to kind of expand out and see how he is typical in all of these ways.
What about the African element? You mentioned that the discovery of the West Indies, or what they called the West Indies, which is of course anything but the West Indies, resulted in, I'm quoting you here, less complicated societies than the ones discovered in southern Spain, or the ones conquered in southern Spain from previous colonizers of southern Europe. The Portuguese, at the same time, were discovering, again, I use that word carefully, quote unquote, discovering Africa. Was there a connection between what the Portuguese were doing in Africa and what Columbus was doing in the West Indies and then North America?
I think that they're both the Portuguese and Columbus working for the Castilians, or for the Spaniards, let's say. They're both looking for a way to get to Asia so that they can access the spice trade in Asia without having to go through the Middle East, which is becoming united under an Islamic empire, right? And so they're trying to get a direct access in two different ways. One by, well, they're both sailing south, but south and then west, or south underneath Africa. But along the way, they are discovering and looking for slightly different things. The Portuguese are looking for direct access to gold and to the slave trade in Africa. So there's a slave trade in Africa that's been going on for hundreds of years, and slaves have been taken across the Sahara Desert. And by sailing down the coast of Africa, you can cut out those middlemen and get more direct access to those markets. So that's a little different from what the Castilians or the Spaniards think they're going to do by sailing west to get directly to the Spice Islands. However, when they find islands, they assume the same kind of thing the Portuguese are assuming, right? That there's access to some kind of a slave trade here, which is good short-term profits for explorers who are themselves really colonizers and potential settlers, all of them. Good short-term profits. And then maybe if there's a complex settled society like the kind that there are in Africa, then there's all kinds of trade possibilities. So in that sense, it's a sort of variance on the same kind of theme. Nobody's looking for a new world, right? That's a kind of a rewriting of the history.
Who invented the term New World?
Oh, I should know that. Now you put me. It's just a matter of time before somebody like you, Andrew, asked me a question.
Yeah,
like I'm in the classroom and it's one of these
no
things.
excuses. I think you may
as soon
get
as we stop talking, I'm going to
university.
remember who came up with the phrase "the New World." It was one of the Spanish commentators early in the 16th century, or it could have been Peter Martyr, who was actually Italian. But it was very early in the 16th century. Somebody kind of coined that phrase, and it stuck a little bit. Kind of
what about the issue of race? Of course, it dominates 21st century American life. Was Columbus a racist? When he saw these people of different colored skins, did he think they were inferior?
Yeah, our concept of race and racism evolved a little bit after Columbus's lifetime. So it really, historians, of course, argue about everything and argue about exactly when it came about. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, more or less in the 16th century is the beginning of this sort of evolution of the concept of races, that you can divide humankind into these kind of large blocks. And a lot of that comes out of the European experience in the Americas and the beginning of this idea that we're not going to enslave anybody that we can, or conquered peoples, or certain kinds of loopholes like, oh, cannibals can be enslaved, but you can't enslave a Christian, and so on. Instead, in the 16th century, there's the beginning of this idea that you can only enslave sub-Saharan African peoples. And that to some historians argue, that then leads to the idea of modern racism, and others argue it's modern racist ideas that allow that concept about slavery to. So the two things are all happening at the same time. In Columbus's day, I don't think he would have really understood what we were talking about. Those would have been slightly alien concepts to him. But what he was, which is what other Iberians and Italians were in his era, was profoundly ethnocentric. In other words, all peoples, all kind of ethnic groups defined by, yes, the color of their skin, their customs, their religion, the languages that they spoke, and so on. So this is a smaller set of definitions than would underpin modern racial ones. All of those people could be ranked as superior and inferior. And that was something that was constantly being observed, like, well, who are these people and where do they fit? Sort of between us, that would be, these are the Europeans would be thinking us at the top, and they would kind of go all the way down to people who are virtually like animals. And there was some discussion about indigenous peoples. Are they like animals, or if they are humans, however low they are in this structure, then they have souls, and therefore they can be converted, and therefore that's what we need to do. That's like the most important thing, is to convert them to Christianity and so on. So was Columbus ethnocentric in that sense? Oh, yes, absolutely. Just as everybody else was. And we read the comments that he makes about indigenous peoples. It's very easy for us to see those through the lens of modern racism and go, whoa, this guy is like incredibly racist. So in that sense, Andrew, yes, he was. But I think we got to kind of understand that.
You're pushing me over to supporting Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day, although not all Europeans, Matthew, were racist. I mean, not all adventurers. You think of Marco Polo or Montesquieu's stuff about Islam. I mean, by definition, it didn't, just by being a European didn't mean that, especially in this period, didn't mean that one thought of oneself as superior, did it?
Not you're right that there is. We can certainly find people who wrote things about other peoples that show that they had a kind of a genuine interest that was not overly tinged by judgment and a sense of superiority. I mean, I think it's got a blanket statement. Europeans were more likely to see themselves as being superior to other peoples, but this is not just a European phenomenon. So, to kind of jump out of the Columbus subject for a moment, when Spaniards get to the Aztec Empire, when they get to Mexico, and they see themselves as superior to the indigenous peoples, they also recognize that indigenous peoples there are ranked from kind of superior to inferior. And some Spaniards, they think that are very so impressed by the cities that the Aztecs have built and their complex society and so on, that they see their aristocracy as being, if only they would convert them to Christianity, they're almost kind of at the same sort of level. And they also are aware of the fact that within Mexico, this kind of ethnocentrism still operates, so that people in central Mexico see themselves as civilized, and other indigenous groups that in old English terminology we would have said tribes, right, who live subject to the empire or on the margins of empire are seen as very much inferior. So it's important I'm not saying Europeans are racist and nobody else is in the world, right? In fact, I'm trying to get away from the racist term. I think ethnocentrism is how human communities view other communities and groups throughout the world at this time. And that's an unfortunate setup for how people are going to interact.
Let me revise the question then. As I said, you wrote another very popular book, When Montezuma Met Cortez. Cortez, of course, was the Spanish adventurer who, again, so to speak, discovered Aztec Mexico. Had Columbus, distinguishing maybe between Christopher Columbus and Cortez, Columbus didn't discover, as you know, these kind of complex civilizations, the Aztecs or the Incas. Would he have been different from Cortez, do you think? More respectful, less bloodthirsty?
Oh, I don't think so. I think Columbus gets shunted aside by 1500. He is shunted aside by the Spanish imperial authorities, let's say. I mean, Spain as a nation is only just coming into being, let alone as an empire. But he's shunted aside pretty quickly. If it had been Columbus who had discovered the Aztec Empire, if he'd landed on the coast of Mexico, and the Spaniards who were with him had engaged that empire, I think the realization that there was such wealth there, that there was such sort of potential for a successful colony, would have resulted in him being shunted aside even sooner. I don't think he would have kind of survived the wheeling and dealing and the machinations that are going on there. Because when the Spaniards arrive on that coast in 1519, they spend months up and down the coast trying to figure out where they are and what this thing is that we now know as the Aztec Empire. But they're fighting among themselves, even to the extent of some mutilated and killed, some Spaniards by other Spaniards, as they're kind of trying to jostling for power. And I think in a circumstance like that, Columbus would not have come out very well. Whether that's to his credit or not, I leave that to you or the listeners to decide.
Yeah, and in this debate between Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day, we've done a number of shows with historians of quote unquote indigenous American peoples. I guess that there seems to be a fundamental rethinking of the zeitgeist when it comes to the values and achievements of the indigenous people. What exactly, that's a big question, Matthew, maybe you can answer it very briefly. You note that he found less complex societies. That sounds to me slightly euphemistic. What exactly did he find?
Yeah, I know. Well, you're spotting the careful use of language, right? Because,
well, as a historian, especially teaching in American universities, you have to. It's a form of self-preservation, isn't it?
Yeah, you're totally right about that. But also, I mean, I really have tried for many years when talking about this to students to emphasize the environmental determinant factors, right? Why in the Americas? Because that's what I'm talking about. But it would be the same if we were talking about Europe, Asia, Africa. Why do some societies look this way and some look a different way? Why are some building cities of stone buildings and therefore all the kind of social, economic, political structure that makes all of that possible? And others aren't. They're making temporary camps and moving around seasonally and mostly hunting and fishing rather than growing crops. Europeans really wanted to make those be hallmarks of civilization versus barbarism. They really wanted to they were hell-bent on this idea of dividing peoples into these two camps. And sometimes that was about religion. Sometimes it was about other markers of what they saw as civilization, like, a writing system that they thought was equivalent to theirs, people being fully clothed. Look, it's cold in Europe, especially in the north, but even in the south, people have a lot of clothing. In tropical areas, they don't. So there's an environmental reason for that, but Europeans wanted to make it about civilization versus barbarism.
Yeah, the clothing thing. Last week I was in Amsterdam and I went, of course, to the Rijksmuseum, and I can't remember which piece of art, but there was this image of, I think it must have been Cortez in Mexico and fighting people who were completely unclothed, which surprised me at least. I mean, you don't have to live in that complex a society to have clothing, do you?
Yeah, I don't think any historians believe that indigenous people.
Yeah, exactly.
Naked,
I mean, it's one of the ultimate constructions.
Yeah, they had light clothing, which is then, seen in Europe as like it's just a slight exaggeration. Let's just make them completely.
That's like as Europeans now have light clothing or slight clothing when they go visit Mexico.
That's right. Even more so than the locals, right?
Exactly.
There's a kind of a total flipping there. Tourists in shorts and tank tops going places where no local people would ever, dress with that little of clothing. No, I think it's a tricky issue to talk about the differences between indigenous cultures in the Americas and the huge variety, because it's so easy to kind of slip into that colonialist mentality, right? Whereby you're kind of ranking them on a spectrum from civilization to barbarism. And that's not really the point. But the fact is that the cities that the Spaniards saw on the mainland, in the Aztec Empire, in the Maya area, essentially what is today most of Mexico and Central America, let alone what they saw in the Andes when they get to the Andes a decade after that. Those are completely different societies than the ones that the Spaniards encounter in the Caribbean, right? And Spaniards are not looking to destroy native societies. They're not looking to enslave everybody and kill people and so on. I realize that's what ends up happening, but what they're looking for is societies upon which they can build colonies. So the model is really what happened in let's say in Malaga or Cordoba or Granada, the cities in southern Spain that the Christian kingdoms eventually permanently conquered and took from their Muslim rulers. Yes, there was some slaughter and enslavement, but by and large, they want those cities to continue to exist, the agricultural operations to continue to exist, because that's then the basis of the wealth of the new colony, the new conquered area that's been conquered by Spaniards. And that just doesn't work in the Caribbean. That's really the problem. Can I circle back, Andrew, to something?
Of course, you can do anything you want.
Yeah, because I don't want us to run out of time, and we've been talking about Indigenous Peoples Day versus Columbus Day, and I think to really understand that those two things, there's only so far we can go by talking about the historic Columbus, like what he did, what he found, what Indigenous peoples were like at the time. I think to really understand that divide, we have to think about the United States in the 19th and 20th century, really the last kind of 200 years of American history, to understand how Columbus is remade in America. There's a new Columbus is created very early in American history. I talk about him in my book as the American Columbus, or as the Adam.
So this was one of his 9 lives.
Yes, these are the lives I get to at the end of the book, right? So the 9 lives aren't all lives that he lived himself historically. That's really the beginning of the book. The later lives are kind of posthumous lives, or the whole point about kind of the 9 lives of Columbus is not that he's like a cat who cheats death 8 times. So the metaphor doesn't hold up completely.
There's
right?
no feline metaphor here.
Yeah, they're like avatars, right? It's like 9 separate avatars, and the 8th and 9th ones are the American ones. It's the American Columbus, the patriotic hero, Columbus as an American icon, and then the Italian American Columbus. And those two are closely related. They're like siblings, and kind of that's a bad metaphor because in many places they overlap, but they're not the same. And so the Columbus that Columbus Day people are often defending is the Italian American Columbus, and that Columbus has nothing to do with indigenous peoples. That's an Italian American Columbus who, for them, is a precursor to their ancestors who migrated from Italy in the late 19th, early 20th century. And that's hundreds of years after the story that we've been talking about, right?
Right, completely different.
Completely different. But for indigenous peoples or people who support Indigenous Peoples Day as the name, that Italian American Columbus has nothing to do with what they're thinking of the historic Columbus. They're thinking of a process of colonization that brought disease, colonies, slaughter, so on, all the factors that resulted in the indigenous population dropping by 70 to 90% in the 100 years after Columbus came, right? Not immediately because of Columbus, not in Columbus's lifetime, but there was a process that was begun, and they see Columbus as a symbol of that. And my argument is that we've got to kind of remove Columbus from that story to some extent. Otherwise, he becomes responsible for everything, good or bad, right?
Yeah, he's so what does your book is called The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. As you say, he's not a cat, so there's no feline quality here. Many different lives, many different interpretations, many different periods for thinking and rethinking Columbus. What does it tell us, though, about the art or science of history, Matthew? Max Weber, the great German sociologist, talked about the unintended consequences of most things. There's the history of Columbus. I mean, he was trying to find the Indies, and he described, he called them the West Indies. It was a mistake in the first place. He had no idea what he was doing. Mm-hmm. What does it tell us about shall we say, the art of history, or the art of the historian? I mean, Columbus seems to be a particularly good example of the ironies, of the unintentional qualities of history.
Yeah, I like that. I like that question. And you're right that, I want people to come away from the book with a kind of a different understanding of how there are multiple Columbuses. And I want by the time they get to the end of the book, to kind of see how the Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day battle is about so much more than just a battle between what Columbus did and how he treated indigenous peoples. But also, as you're kind of implying, I want people to come away with a kind of a thinking more about something that I call myth history. And realizing that myth history is always found in history, or the way that history is written and thought about, right? That we have, as human beings, we weave mythology, and I don't mean mythology in the Greek sense. I mean sort of invented stories, legends, distortions of things that really happen, and we weave those into how we see history, and that process is very organic and alive. Just because an event happened in the past doesn't mean to say that it's set in stone. It's actually, we don't ever really know exactly what happened. It's impossible for us to reconstruct that absolutely perfectly. And so our sense of it is just constantly changing and changing. And Columbus is a really good way of looking at that. Like, why is it that we're still arguing about a guy who died 520 years ago? How is that? How does he possibly matter? Well, as I would say, because he doesn't really die, right? He still lives on in the form of all these other manifestations and avatars and creations. And not only that, but our sense of whatever moment in the past we want to talk about, whether it's 1492 or or 1892, the huge celebrations then. Our sense and understanding of all of those past events is colored by everything that's happened since. In a way, every time there's an October moment where people are pulling statues down, that then impacts and creates new filters for how we see what's happened all the way back in the past. And so, I mean, I don't want people to read the book and be like, well, okay, then they'll be back in this kind of 1990s postmodern world in which there's no such thing as truth or whatever. I'm not that extreme about it, but I think, yes, we need to always be aware that these kinds of historical stories contain elements of misconception and invention and myth and so on.
So in a way, the fact that Columbus is sometimes treated as a saint or religious icon is kind of weirdly accurate. The 9 lives, you've talked about a couple of them, Matthew. If you'd have written just the one life of Christopher Columbus, what is the truest? It's not the true life, but what's the truest life of Columbus?
Well, the book I did not want to write was just another biography, because there's lots of biographies of Columbus, right? And so his historic lives are lives 1 and 2. And so those, I suppose, life 1 in a way is the most straightforward. So that's what I call his ordinary life. From birth to 1492, that's the first 40 years of his life is very ordinary. It's after that, his second life, the life when he's famous and infamous from the first voyage to his death, that's his extraordinary life. And that's when things kind of start to become complicated. And I think, kind of in the spirit of your question, like, what's the truest? It's probably that one. If I had to, if you said, let's restate the question, pick one of the lives and then turn that into an entire book, I probably would go up to the end of the book, to one of the ones at the end, what I think of as the American and the Italian American Columbus, because I feel as if other scholars have written about these Columbuses and how they are different and so on, but not in a way that's really accessible. I hope that Italian Americans read the Italian American chapter and go, okay, this guy kind of understands where we're coming from. But also people who think that statues should be pulled down, who maybe are coming out of a place of sympathy with Black Lives Matter or the American Indian movement, and would read the America Columbus chapter and say, yeah, okay, this guy also understands where we're coming from, right? What our kind of position is, and how we are talking at cross purposes, because these are different Columbuses. Is that kind of the true? I suppose you could describe, as I try to do in one of the chapters, the American Columbus, the patriotic Columbus, and kind of
and interestingly, on Amazon, the book, which is just out, is #1 new release in slavery and emancipation history. So you're probably in 9 categories, Matthew. But you're #1 in slavery and emancipation history, which I'm not sure Columbus is about. So what you're suggesting is that Fitzgerald's famous remark that there are no second lives in American history or in America is particularly absurd. It's a very interesting conversation, very appropriate for our upcoming Columbus Day. I have to ask you finally.
Yes.
You've also written a book about Elton John. You very distinguished scholar, also prolific. What would Elton think of Columbus? Did you ever ask him? Did you ever meet him?
No, I never met him.
Is there anything in common between Elton John, who's also a man of constant reinvention, and Christopher Columbus?
Yeah, I get asked about that, and
I thought that was an original question. You mean everyone asks you the same question?
No, I get asked more. What people ask me is about Elton John and Montezuma, and I do have a lecture which I will give when asked, with the title of which is what do Elton John and Montezuma have in common?
Not Cortez. Everyone likes Elton, so Montezuma is the innocent, right?
No, he has more in common with Montezuma. I mean, they were both collectors. Elton John and Montezuma, two of the great the great collectors in human history, I would say. But yes, it's the Elton John Columbus thing is, no, I'm not often asked that, Andrew. That is a fairly unique question. But I would say yes. You got it. It's about misunderstanding
and reinvention. I mean, I don't think I'm quite. I grew up with Elton John like you. We both grew up in England. But especially the movie about him. I mean, he's a man of remarkable reinvention. I don't know how many lives he had, but he certainly had more than one.
Yeah, no, you're right. The 9 Lives of Elton John would be a much better title for my Elton John book. The title was determined by the press. But yes, how about that? See, no one, Andrew, has prompted me to have that thought. The book should be called The 9 Lives of Elton John. So thank you. Actually, I'm not sure I should thank you for that. Now that's going to be stuck in my head forever.
Yeah, it's embarrassing now. But you, this new book is fascinating. The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. You couldn't be more right, of course, Matthew. He has probably more than 9 lives. It's certainly more than one. Important conversation about perhaps one of the most appropriately misunderstood figures, certainly in North American history. Matthew Restall, author of The 9 Lives of Christopher Columbus. The book is just out. It's #1 in slavery and emancipation studies already. Maybe we can make it #1. What would be another category, Matthew?
Latin American history, exploration, history. How about history?
History, then you'd be famous.
That's
anyway, good luck with the book, Matthew. Lovely conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks for having me on. Bye.